Good evening. My name is Janet Werner. This is a welcome to our Go Live Media That Matters, focused on the 988. Tonight, we have 6 featured guests, special guests from around the country who will be brought on one by one, give their introduction, and share a little bit about their experience, their perspective on the challenges, the opportunities, and even what is 988 in their specific profession. So our objective tonight is twofold. One, it's just to open the conversation. Tomorrow, we're at the first year anniversary of 988, and we're still working out the kinks. All the states are not signed on this. Our state in New Jersey is, and many other states. We want to explore the challenges and opportunities so each of us in our own states and across the country can start to make improvements before we get too far underway. We're going to also introduce the cultural and spiritual competency aspect for first responders, screeners, and mental health care providers, and even families and friends who use the 988 for a crisis situation. There are situations where it looks like a mental health situation, but it's actually a spiritual experience. And we'll get into some of the details of that when we get into the conversation. So that's one of our unique aspects. I'm going to bring Ernie Stevens on, and Ernie will introduce himself and also give us an introduction to what is 988. Very, very experienced professional. And Ernie, once you introduce yourself, give us a preview of 988, then please start to share what are your concerns and opportunities. Why do you even care about 988? So please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Janet, for having me. And to all the panelists that are going to join us later, I thank you for their time. And for those watching that took the time out of your evening after a long day of working or whatever you were doing, I appreciate you joining this conversation because it is something we need to do and understand what 988 is. When do we call 988, and what happens when we call 988? As Janet just talked about, we are at our 1-year anniversary. It was actually on July 16th of 2022 that 988 was launched, and that's when people in crisis can reach the suicide and crisis lifeline just by dialing or texting 988. Previously, that crisis line was a 10-digit number, and it is very difficult for people to remember that number. But 988 services are distinct and they're separate from the emergency medical and public safety responses associated with 911. So what is 988 and when do I call it? Well, it's a new resource for people in crisis. It's a transformative movement in America that normalizes people calling for mental health services when in a crisis. And furthermore, what it does is it limits law enforcement's involvement into the crisis, which I think is what really community members have been asking for such a long time. 988 is more than just an easy to remember number. It's a direct connection to compassionate, accessible care and support for anyone experiencing a mental health distress, including thoughts of suicide, mental health or substance use crisis, non-crisis emotional distress, or concern for a loved one who may need crisis support. So as you can see, there's a lot of facets to 988. You can call, you can text, you can chat the number. What we've seen already in just this 1 year is the number of calls have doubled. So last year, the numbers were a little over 2 million people called the crisis line and the suicide help hotline. This year, because 988 is such an easy number to remember, we've had over 4 million people call. And I think what's most interesting about the calls is the data that has been tracked. And that is 98% of the calls that come into 988 are resolved over the phone. It's usually a resource or somebody maybe just needs to talk with somebody, maybe de-escalate or just vent. I mean, I vent every time the Dallas Cowboys play and I need somebody to talk to. So it's not unusual, for somebody to need somebody to talk to. That's nothing to joke about. That's a serious matter. And 988 provides that opportunity. But with 988 comes some challenges, right? Number one, do you even know what 988 is or when to call? What does law enforcement know about 988 and when do they give out that resource to community members? What happens If you don't know about 988 and you call 911, will that call ever be transferred by law enforcement to 988? Because these are to protect your privacy. It's anonymous. That's very important that 988 was established with the idea of to provide that anonymity to the caller. The challenges, though, that come with 988 is there is no geofencing for these calls. And what I mean by that is I live in Texas. I was just in Colorado yesterday. So if I was in Colorado and I called 988, because of my area code, the number would have rung in Texas, and I would have had a mental health professional answer the call 988 in Texas. If I would have needed resources in Colorado, it would have taken some time to route that call back into a tower that's closest to my location. So there are some challenges. There's challenges of liability when it comes to transferring a call from law enforcement to 988. There's liability when you don't geofence a call, because what happens if somebody calls in that is acutely suicidal and there's no way to send help to that person because you just don't know where they are. So it's a good discussion that we're going to have. We're going to talk about the pros and the cons of 988. We're going to talk about ways that we can improve it, because if you look at the 911 system, it took at least 10 years for that system even to get online and start working properly. So I ask that you be patient with the 988 process as states learn how to make this sustainable by using federal dollars to fund this, along with taxpayers, or not taxpayer dollars, but your cell phone bill. You may see a charge there for 988 if you haven't already, because they're looking at ways to make this sustainable for people all across the United States. So thank you for having me again, Janet. And I did forget one thing. Who is this guy? So this guy, Ernie Stevens.
Who's Ernie?
Yeah. Yeah. So I spent 28 years in law enforcement with the San Antonio Police Department. I was a mental health officer. So I responded on the mental health unit to people that would call in for a mental health crisis. And then my job was to go out there and try to find the best resources possible for the individual, whether that was try to find them an intake appointment, offer resources, take them to go see a provider. Whatever the issue was, we were trying to do our best to, number one, divert away from jails and prisons, and number two, create some type of treatment plan for that individual to where they could be successful on the back end of the call and have resources and wraparound services where they wouldn't need to call the police. I'm now currently the Deputy Division Director for the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and I lead the portfolio for the Law Enforcement Division. And 988 is a big topic on the national level that we're talking about, and trying to find ways to build a roadmap and make it just a better way to work together collaboratively with law enforcement partners.
Thank you so much for that intro. Ernie, from the year I've known you, the term that also comes to mind is de-escalation. You put that into my mind and heart, that's what you do sincerely, you and Joe. The movie that you have, Crisis Cops, shows that so clearly. And that just to me almost is the precursor to what we're doing. Like you are doing de-escalation. You have influenced so many people. And that's what we also need in the whole 988 process to de-escalate. So thank you. Thank you so much to be here. We're going to bring in another familiar face to you, Ernie, Dr. Olivia Johnson. So welcome, Olivia. And we'll ask you to also introduce yourself from the Blue Wall Institute, your background, what you do, and also then why do you care about 988? What are some of your challenges and concerns that you see?
Sure. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for being here. And Janet, thanks for having me. So I actually work with the Blue Wall Institute. I'm the main founder. I do research, I do consulting and needs assessment. I have made my focus within the last 15 years in the area of suicide, what we call inoculation now. And we pull data. We collect, autopsies, toxicologies, police reports, and we put together a database that tracks why these things are happening. So for me, anything that can be an opportunity, such as 988, is going to give us another resource. And there's always going to be things that we need to work out and things that aren't going to go as planned. And that's why we get groups together and we start to brainstorm and think about how we can make it better. But as Ernie, came to the conclusion earlier when he made the comment that, we've doubled in these calls, guys. We need something simpler, and that when you make it simpler, they're going to use it. We just have to make sure that when we have the influx of people, which is a challenge, that we also have the people answering the phones, and we have the challenges that Ernie mentioned with geofencing, not being able to track someone right where they're at. On the flip side of that, for me, a challenge is when someone calls that is not actively suicidal and they're trying to find out where they're calling from. So we really have to think about this as a resource, but we also can do no harm, and we have to be really careful about overstepping boundaries where people may not reach out in the future. So one of my biggest challenges is understanding, number one, exactly what 988 is, what it does in each different location in those states that are actually participating, and making sure that people are educated on what it is. Because when you share information, I don't want to give information out that's not true, or I say something to someone to use it and I find out later that they think that someone overstepped their bounds and now they'll never call or use it again. That's not what we want. I think that kind of did start initially when it was launched. I think that happened and people got scared because a lack of education breeds fear. But we also have to be really careful that if we don't educate appropriately, and if we don't talk openly and make sure that we're standardizing the text that we're using, there will be differences in what's being said and how it's interpreted. So, I think the biggest challenge that I see with this is making sure that we have people to fill those calls, and that we're not letting people go on hold or falling through the cracks, and that we're really clear about what this is. In fact, I saw something come out the other day on the radio. It was a law enforcement officer of an agency that was talking about the suicide prevention lifeline and gave out the 10-digit number. And I was like, did he not hear about 988? And it isn't, I can't say it's concerning, but again, there's got to be standardization in how this number is shared and how people are educated on it, and that there's a standard message of what it is and what it isn't and what it can do for communities, especially as Ernie suggested too, is this is, not another thing that law enforcement needs to be doing all the time. Like, they're getting tasked with everything when people call 911. This is a separate thing that can be used if really managed well. It can be managed in a way that really is useful and can take a lot of that stress and additional workload off of the first responders that are out there.
Dr. Olivia, thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
So much for that intro. I'm going to have Olivia and Ernie, we're going to go backstage and we're going to invite Anne. Anne will come on and we'll have everybody else back. We're inviting Anne and we're inviting Juliet, both from CSPN New Jersey. So we'll start with Anne. If you would introduce yourself, give us a briefing on why are you here? What do you care about? We'll have Juliet, and then we'll continue with our introductions.
Sure. So good evening, everyone. I'm Ann Smullen-Thieling. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Collaborative Support Programs of New Jersey, also a person with lived experience. CSP&J is a peer-led statewide behavioral health agency. We have 22 community wellness centers that are also peer-run throughout the state. We have 3 peer wellness respites, which Juliet will talk a little bit more about. We also provide supported housing to over 600 individuals with behavioral health conditions across the state, and also do homelessness outreach, as well as operating Hudson County's warming center. So I'm here because 988 is really critical to the work that we do at CSP&J. In terms of concerns, I think my number one concern is just transparency with 988. Allowing folks to have the full picture to make an informed decision of whether or not they should use 988 in terms of the fact that non-consensual intervention could be a potential outcome, i.e. police could be an outcome, for folks to make that informed decision of whether this is a good opportunity for them to utilize or not. I think also, in terms of opportunity, I think, 988 is a real opportunity for the behavioral health crisis system to change. And I think, peer support should really be an essential feature of this. We don't want to duplicate the current system that we already have. Peer support is an essential feature of SAMHSA's national guidelines for behavioral health crisis care. So I think this is a real opportunity to have 988 link folks to other peer-led alternatives and other alternatives from the mainstream crisis care, traditional mental health that we currently have. So I will turn it over to Juliet.
Yes, and we do want to get more calls directed to CSPN New Jersey, so we'll get into that as well. Juliet, thank you for joining us tonight. Are you mute, or is it working?
Thank you. So my name is Juliet Quiles, and I am the program manager at one of the respites in New Jersey. We do have 3 respites throughout New Jersey. We're hoping for more. It is an alternative to being hospitalized, and as Anne mentioned, it'd be a wonderful collaboration with 988. I know that mentioned with de-escalation, we know it when it's crisis, right? So figuring out the unmet need of the people we're serving for those 10 days to utilize through us, as Anne mentioned, that we are an agency that throughout the agency are peers, which means that we have lived in experience ourselves. So we either have a mental health diagnosis, or we're in recovery, or we have cared for a loved one that has struggled with a mental health diagnosis or a substance use diagnosis. So really just the peer piece that we can really foster through the people that we serve. So one way that, why do we care, right? So 988 would be such a wonderful asset in helping anyone in New Jersey. So I'm really excited to hear more about 988 and how we can collaborate as an agency. Excited to be here, and thank you everyone for being here today.
Excellent. And as we, I'm so glad that we can bring this piece in. And if there's a way to get this link up, that there is the National Empowerment Center has a link for peer respites all around the country. Mm-hmm. And if we don't post it now, we'll post it shortly. But there are peer respites in at least, a number of our states. And just for family members, friends, medical doctors, the 988 call to know that these exist. And very, very thankful for that. We'll get into a little bit of personally why I care about that. So we'll come back with Anne and Juliet in a moment. So, and we're going to be bringing in Christina. So Christina and I just met recently with an advocacy group that is also nationwide. Christina is right here in New York. I'm in New Jersey, so love some of the East Coast connections. Christina, thank you for joining us, and please introduce yourself around your professional work, and then also why do you care about 988? What do you see as some of the challenges and concerns, maybe specifically in New York?
Thank you for having me here today, Janet. So my name is Christina Sparrock. I'm a certified public accountant by profession, and I live with bipolar disorder, severe anxiety, and PTSD. I serve on the Assembly member Monique Chandler Waterman's mental health task force, and I'm a member of the New York State Multicultural Advisory Committee, where I advise the commissioner and elected officials on best practices on mental health policies. I'm also the creator of the first ever person-centered mental health response pilot in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, that trains law enforcement, peers, and community members on how to respectfully respond to people living with mental health, substance use, misuse, those who are unhoused, and just involved people in our community. So my first question is about why do you think, for me, is 988 is important? So I would like to rephrase that question as like, why do I care about 988? Mm-hmm. Why is it important to me, and why it should be important to others? My answer to that is basically 988 will help decriminalize mental health. It will help destigmatize mental health. It would normalize mental health and divert people from the criminal legal system and over hospitalization to care. My concerns in the community about 988 is more like we need to raise more awareness. I know that Ernie mentioned it was like double of the calls that came in over the past year. And that's I did a research in the Forbes magazine, and Forbes magazine just stated that it was like in today's magazine that 80%, 86% of Americans do not know about 988. So you can only imagine if those 86% of the people knew how many more calls we received for 988. And Ernie also mentioned that it took 10 years for 911 for people to know about it. So we don't have 10 years for 988. It needs to be immediately. Everybody needs to be raised awareness about it immediately. And it could be done in like public service announcements at schools, community events, and community boards, and whatever events you need to talk about, churches everywhere about 988, because it's better than calling 911 for a response. I live with a mental health condition. I do not want to call 911. I'd rather call 988 for a response. I'm also concerned about the geolocation locations, which Ernie has mentioned as well. In New York City, we have New York City Well. That's our mental health response. You call 1-888 NYC Well, or you text 65173 at 24/7 hours a day. So we have our own unique mental health response. But what happens now is that you call 988. 988 is actually routed to New York City Well's account. Our numbers in New York City we have seven numbers: 212-332-347, 646-718, 917, and 929. So you can imagine if you're having a crisis and you have a Georgia number in New York City, right here in New York City, your call, if you call 988, would get routed to Georgia. So where are your New York City supports? They're not, because you don't have anyone because you routed your call to Georgia because you're in your area code. So that's a geolocation issue. What I also think about 988, we talk so much about crisis, but we never think about prevention, right? Everything we provide services, crisis. But what about prevention and intervention? Prevention is more effective and less costly than a crisis. New York receives approximately 200,000 911 crisis calls, or they call EDP calls, or emotional disturbed people calls annually. And instead of providing immediate care and support, they send police. Having 200,000 calls diverted to 988 can reduce the interactions and trauma dealing with law enforcement and hospitalization and direct people directly to care. In this situation with 200,000 people, 988 crisis councils can actually offer opportunities to de-escalate the situation and connect people to services and to care, such as respite centers, counseling, and housing. Another opportunity that I see with 988 is definitely we need more adequate, culturally responsive, person-centered, trauma-informed, affordable, and gender-appropriate care in the community. We only have 24 mobile crisis teams in New York City, right? And they only operate from 8 to 8. And these mobile crisis teams come out to help people when they're in crisis. And they can arrange to be transported to the hospital if necessary. We have over 8 million people in New York City. How are we only having 24 mobile crisis teams? So that means a lot of people are not getting their services met. So that means if you're calling for a crisis and they can't show up, who shows up? It's 911. We need more free quality respite centers. We only have 8 respite centers in New York City with 64 beds, and only one of them is ADA compliant. So we need, I'm just throwing this out there. We'll need at least 100 respite centers, but we're funding more law enforcement towards the budget as opposed to more healthcare responses in our communities. We need more clubhouses. We need to incentivize clinicians to accept more insurances. A lot of them don't accept Medicare. And a lot of people in crisis do have Medicare and insurances that they don't accept. We also need to encourage people, who particularly BIPOC people, to take mental health courses and provide the services in their communities and get paid a fair wage to help their communities. And we also need to provide all non-traditional ways of therapy as well, like Reiki, chakra, spiritual healing, everything. Because it's like we don't tailor the mental health care treatment towards the person. It's always like a one size fit all, take a pill. And it doesn't work that way for everyone. We need to listen to people because we're all unique people from different worldviews and backgrounds, and we need to tailor it for them. And we need to set up appointments. We don't need to wait 6 weeks for an appointment if we're in crisis, because it's only going to escalate. We need to have like 24-hour clinics on the corner, like urgent cares, like you have city MDs on every single block. If you have a cold, you get a pill. There should be a therapist in every city MD. Says, I don't feel well today. I need a bed to lay in for like 8 hours and someone to talk to and get some yoga. And then I'm okay and send me back into the community. So that's my take on what I care about, why is it important, and some opportunities for 988.
Christina, thank you so much. You really covered the gamut and definitely touched on a place that is very dear to my heart about alternative methods, and even bringing up, these opportunities of yoga and like a holistic center on the corner, like urgent care. I love it. Thank you for putting that out there. Christina, will welcome you back in just a moment with the group, but I'm bringing Dr. Chatlos on as our final guest here to introduce himself. And Dr. Chatlos is also part of our global team and an investor in our Media That Matters projects. And Dr. Chatlos, if you would just introduce your professional background and then go right into the 988. Why are you here? Why do you care? What do you see as the opportunities and challenges? And then once you are finished, we're bringing everybody on to start to dialogue. So welcome, Dr. Chatlos.
Great. Thank you, Janet, for inviting me. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I notice that many conversations about 988 psychiatrists are often left out. And I want to talk to not just psychiatrists, but I really want to speak to the first responders and those people that are at the police stations, at the hospitals, in the emergency rooms. And Janet, there's a few things that I think from my perspective, specifically the psychiatric perspective, that are critical. Christina and Ernie talked about the functioning of 988. I'd like to talk about, once that's operational and going well, which hopefully as soon as possible, the first responders, the people that get the call and are sent out. There's a dictum in medicine, in the Hippocratic Oath, of, first of all, do no harm. And 988 is being promoted to correct harms that have been done previously with police involvement, forced hospitalization, forced medications, misdiagnosis. And there are situations of behaviors and emotions that, if they're not understood, can do devastating damage. So I'd like to take a couple minutes. First of all, and I know this is your interest, spiritual and religious experience. There are strong spiritual and religious experiences that can be part of crisis, and they are not mental disorders. Very important. They don't need police, they don't need hospitalization, and they are not a psychiatric diagnosis. I like I don't know if you've mentioned it, the acronym AWARE, AWARE. Are we aware of religious experience? I think that should be in the back of the mind of all first responders and all people that end up being connected with 988. The second thing is psychosis. Someone calling and they're sort of out of touch with reality. Psychosis doesn't automatically mean schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and may not even need hospitalization. Spiritual and religious experiences themselves can be so extreme they lose touch with reality. The psychosis may be part of a spiritual emergency, but they don't need hospitalization. In fact, that may be one of the most harmful things to be done at that time. They need compassion and understanding and support in a safe place, not involving police or hospitalization. A third thing is trauma. The majority of emotional and behavioral crises are related to trauma, a life event in the moment that triggered past traumas. But I know in the psychiatric profession, in emergency rooms and hospitals, we have to look for this. It's not going to be obvious. So these people also are likely to not need hospitalization, even if it is extreme enough to trigger hopelessness and suicidal thoughts. Just connecting today's crisis reaction with possible events from the past is often enough to disappear the hopelessness or the intensity of the reaction and avoid some of the complications. So as a awareness and knowledge of these three options alone would be a huge success: spiritual and religious experience, psychosis, and trauma. And there's a fourth that I like to emphasize and bring out, and I hope our work with the film and everything brings that out, that spiritual and religious experiences in crisis may be the beginning of a new opportunity. These experiences are often a sign that there is an opening to a transformational process that, if it's properly recognized and guided, can not only not harm lives, not only not lead to hospitalizations, but can positively change lives. I would love to see the psychiatric profession put spirituality much more at the center. So I think that's all I have to say for
Wow.
now. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to do this and be part of this. Thank you, Janet.
Great overview, and focused to direct me to really the next step. I'm going to actually invite Ernie first back to just comment a little bit, and then we'll bring the whole group back. A year ago, I asked Ernie if he ever heard of people having a spiritual or religious experience when you went out to mental health calls and you were de-escalating. And if you would comment on that, and then what you have, it seems that you have really studied a lot from that moment when I said there's really a real thing here, of which you said that you do have the experience. And Ernie, as you comment, we'll have just a chit chat a little bit back, and then we'll bring everybody. We might put up the link around Spiritual Competency Academy with Dr. Lukoff as you start to go. Ernie.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you, Doctor, for your comments. They really do hit home. I spent 28 years in law enforcement, but my last 12 years were dedicated strictly to a mental health unit. So I was dispatched out to calls of every variety you could think of. People that were feeling suicidal, people that were struggling with PTSD, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, you name it. Many occasions, when we arrived on scene, there was this, in a term used in law enforcement, it's not to offend anybody, was a hyper-religiosity. A person was experiencing hyper-religiosity where either they believed that their creator was speaking to them and giving them command, I guess just commands to do certain things or act a certain way. And it was very difficult, being an officer, that you get some training, you get a little bit of training, crisis intervention training, to learn how to de-escalate and recognize a mental health crisis, and then learn about what resources are available to you. But when you come face to face with an individual that's not truly a danger to themselves, but what they are saying or displaying seems so abnormal to what the general public is doing or acting, it causes confusion for law enforcement. And if you're a first responder, you're supposed to know the answers to everything. So when you're ignorant about what a spiritual crisis or emergency looks like, it's very difficult for you to try to connect and show empathy with an individual that's going through that, right? On the surface and optics, you think, this person's delusional, and I have no other choice probably but to hospitalize them, right? Now, there are some occasions, right? And I'll give you an example of a real case scenario. And it was an individual that was fasting that said that they were not, that their creator gave them the answer of how to solve world hunger, and they were not going to ever eat again unless the president was aware of this plan and would implement, this plan to solve world hunger. This person had not eaten for almost 3 weeks, was looking severely dehydrated, had medics come out to the scene, and there was during the triage of the patient, there was some concerns with their medical condition as well. So there are sometimes scenarios that you face in law enforcement or as a first responder where it's one of those, I don't know what to do. All I know is I want to err on the side of caution. And I only know what to do based on the training I've received. And the training I received really did not cover a whole lot of what a spiritual crisis may look like or how does it present. Because in crisis intervention training, you get psychologists that will come in and speak, psychiatrists that will come in and speak, people that run different types of resources, your local mental health authority, they'll come in and speak. But what you don't get is the spiritual aspect from a credible person, from I guess, a professional in that field, whether it's a chaplain, a pastor, a priest, to come in and really give you a broad overview of, hey, this is how it might present, and this is probably how you might want to try to approach it for best possible outcome. So I'm glad, it's interesting that the conversation developed into this, and then you got to think, how do we tie this back to 988?
Yes.
Well, take law enforcement out of it, and now it's a call taker. And what if a call taker doesn't understand, right? So what are we doing as far as training and implementing policies and procedures to handle a caller that maybe is experiencing one of these situations?
And Dr. Chatlos, I'm going to ask you to hold on your response. I want to invite Dr. Olivia Johnson in because she does have to go. And Dr. Chatlos, I do know have an answer. We want to do some training on it. But Dr. Olivia, we also spoke a year ago about this. And if you want to comment on what your awareness is and what we might want to offer first responders, you and I talked about just a brief orientation of the aware. Are we aware of religious experiences? Because first responders, they can't all know all the competency areas. But if you want to comment before you do have to leave.
Yeah, no, we did talk about this, and we kind of talked about the fact that we can't know every small detail about these things, but to have a general understanding that something isn't right. And I think Ernie nailed it in Dr. Chatlos, is there has to be this level of empathy. When we have something that we don't understand, it's fear-based. Everything that we do is fear-based. So we then want to overreact to these things that are happening. And oftentimes we're doing more damage. We had a young man at our church many years ago, and I was a security director. And the things that he was saying were definitely problematic, but he was not violent. There were people in the church that would almost egg him on, wanting him to do something because they felt that he was violent and they thought that if he acted out, they could get him out of the church. And they really missed the boat here because, a lot of these individuals, especially those suffering from mental health issues and other kinds of things, are often more victimized than they are victimizers. And I think that we really, when we fear something, we operate in that fear-based area and we treat everything to keep it away from us. It's like when I see people online and they see a spider. Well, I don't like spiders. I'm going to kill it. Or a snake, I'm going to kill it. It's like, why don't you take a moment? I used to be scared of spiders. I can now put them in a glass, take them outside, make sure that they go back where they need to go. We've got to stop operating out of fear in everything that we do. And I think if you have some empathy and understand that these are people's loved ones, when I operate and I speak to people or I see someone in need, I treat them as if I would, they're my child, and I'm protecting them from other people and getting them the help that they need and not being judgmental, but understanding they didn't get here overnight, but they need people to understand how to get them where they need to go safely. And we're missing that big component here. We have lost compassion. And it kind of breaks my heart, to be real honest with you, because many of these people, they don't have to be thinking the way that we're thinking. There is nothing wrong with, there's nothing illegal with being mentally ill, having a mental health issue, being in crisis. It's not illegal. And once we kind of step back from that and understand that we don't have to understand every situation, not every situation is going to be logical to us, but dealing with their perceptions at that time, making sure that they're safe and making sure that we're treating them with empathy and with compassion and understanding this is a brief moment in their life and don't define them by this one moment.
So again, some key words of empathy, compassion. There's listening in there, is conversation. Treating them with some agency, what's important to you, not being afraid of what behavior that would not be considered normal to us, but kind of go back to that word de-escalation. You know, how do we de-escalate and really allow the person to participate in the process and choice? And as I speak, you all can continue. I'm going to be bringing in Anne and Christina into the conversation.
Janet, I want to add one more thing real quick while we're here is, you know, our data showed when we talked about completed suicide, the leading issue that was raised in many of these cases was interpersonal relationship issues with family members, with friends, with coworkers, with the community, with, you know, whoever it is. That's a huge component of our lives because we need human connection. And we want it to be pretty. And the truth is, it's beautiful, but it's not always pretty. It's ugly in many cases, and it's dirty, and people have to work at it. And we get afraid of work too. And we need to step back for a moment and just reassess the situation.
So I love that we did bring this piece up. It is unique to our live events and our media work that we're going to bring the spiritual part of mental health crisis into this. And so at this point, Anne, Christina, you can speak specifically into the 988 situation, into the services you provide. And if you want to comment on, there's reality and true spiritual experiences that do look like a mental health crisis. So Anne, why don't you start and pick up on any of the conversation if you'd like to contribute. And as this happens, please post comments, our viewers, comments and questions, and we will be taking those as well. Anne?
Sure. I'd like to comment on, you know, what Dr. Olivia Johnson just mentioned, not defining people by their worst days. You know, we see folks when they're in crisis said probably one of the worst moments in their lives potentially. And I think what she mentioned about compassion is key. I think that's exactly what I would like to see more of with 988 is that compassionate, trauma-informed approach, right? And I think that this is a real opportunity to really make that first and foremost as what could be different about 988 and not duplicating the current mental health system that we already have. You know, I also agree with Christina's statement. We need more respites. I think we, you know, I think it was Ernie that mentioned just the sheer volume of calls that 988 has gotten in comparison to last year. And we know that there is a tremendous amount of need. And I think a need for alternatives to those traditional systems, right? We need places where folks can open up and talk about what they're experiencing without the fear of being re-traumatized and hospitalized against their will. So
excellent point. Again, thank you. Christina, do you want to weigh in on the topics that are opening up here?
So thank you. What was his doctor? What is his name?
Dr. Charles?
Yeah, I like the acronym AWARE. So I'm gonna get a T-shirt. So it's okay.
We are going to make T-shirts.
I love it. So so as it relates to like the peer community, like when I talk about educate people on peers, I always say like, don't look at what's wrong with them, look at what's happened. Because when you think about what's wrong with them, you're always thinking in a deficit way of peers. It's about looking at what happened is the snapshot of time, you know, what happened. It could be something the social determinants of health, like, you know, not having housing or losing their job that's causing a crisis. So if you look at that and not what's wrong with them, it's a better way. So when we talk about training, right, in the peer community, right, what I did differently from like CIT is that I had peers as part of the training model. It was more of a bottom-up approach, not a top-down approach, where I wanted peers to share their lived experience, talk about how they want people to respond to them when they were in crisis. Because often peers, it's like we lose our autonomy. It's like we're afraid of law enforcement, we're afraid of our clinicians, we're afraid of family members. And so when it's in this space, I was able to like have the park enforcement officers actually, it was different. Like I know like the CIT training is usually the peers in the bottom, it's the police in the room, and it's only like one peer and we share our story for like an hour. But what I did differently was to have the park enforcement officers sit in different groups with one peer in each group, and then to have the peer be the report out person and talk about their stories and lived experience. And then after a while, the park enforcement officers, they actually opened up about their own lived experiences which was good. So it became like a more of a community wellness type of program than just us versus them. And that's what we need to stop thinking about, us versus them, to promote wellness, community wellness. So I think that's about it. Oh, the spiritual part, right?
Yes.
So I grew up in a Pentecostal church, right? And growing up, you know, we spoke in tongues. We had the Holy Ghost and the Holy Spirit. We ran down, you know, the aisle and all that stuff. But that was just a way of life. And I remember I had the gift where I was always to prophesize. I was to be able to see things and share experiences before they even happened, which I was extremely scared of because I was a kid. And I used to pray to God, I don't want this experience. I don't want this experience. And I used to see things and tell my mom, so-and-so was calling me to them, whether it was Jesus or some, you know, somebody in the Bible. And she would just tell me to go to them and answer to them and to listen to what they had to say and follow their instructions. And I did that for a while and I was scared, but I know it's real for me. And to me, it wasn't a mental health experience. It was more like a spiritual experience. I think I was just too young to understand it, what I was going through at that time.
Christina, thank you for that opening, because I did promise that I would share my personal experience. In 2005, there was not 988, which we know, but my mother observed my behavior and it was a spiritual experience, and she assumed it was a mental nervous breakdown or a psychotic time. Dr. Chatlos, I'm so thankful that you have commented that even if it was a psychotic experience, it could have resolved itself in 3 days or less. And many of the conversations here about compassion, listening, you know I already settled down before the police were called, and I was escorted to an ER and then admitted, even though I said to the doctors, I'm having a spiritual experience. Look, here it is in the DSM. There's a V code, and I do want to be treated by the V code and not labeled bipolar or whatever. And unfortunately, I spent 14 days in the hospital against my will and forced medicated. That is behind also my passion to see how do we influence and educate in the whole 988 rollout, not just in New Jersey, but across the nation, around the V code and the spiritual competency, the cultural competency, the fact that if you are Pentecostal and you do those kinds of activities out on the street, you will be deemed, psychotic. Inside the church, not so much. So, Dr. Chatlos, if you wanted to comment about your vision, you are looking to include spirituality, spiritual competency training. At least we're focusing on New Jersey. And then I want to go to Juliet, because I'm so thankful you have that peer respite local for people, especially the college students at Rutgers who are right there to go. So Dr. Chatlos and then Juliet.
Yeah, first of all, I didn't have a chance to comment on Ernie and Dr. Johnson's, but I want you two to go on a road show with me. I loved what you said. And one of the things Dr. Johnson said, that she said, these experiences aren't legal problems. I'll underline, they aren't always mental health problems. They are not psychiatric problems. They may be mental health, they may be crises, but that doesn't necessarily mean they get or deserve or should have a psychiatric diagnosis. Janet, let me add something, because Christina, I really appreciated you sharing about the Pentecostal experience. I do research in spiritual experience, and we're recognizing that there is something within us that when it opens has very non-ordinary, unusual, and you can use the word mystical experiences, and it's a real thing. And that's why I mentioned that not only should we see these as not bad or harmful, but probably, maybe so in your case, transformative. They really are. When we can understand them and recognize them, they really are the beginning of an opportunity to literally dramatically change someone's life in a positive way. So I'll end with that.
So Juliet, when we spoke and met at your respite, we did touch on this a little bit. You seemed to relate to it. So would you share a little bit both about the experience with the respite, it is a safe place. You do have college students, and that's also a time, of just mental health crisis, but also spiritual crisis. But you also commented on your cultural heritage and your cultural values, that there's a different view. So Juliet, would you please share your view?
Yes, absolutely. So in regards to respite, right, we meet a person where they are at, making sure that we're using language that is the language that they're using. As a peer-run agency and a peer-run service, we're very mindful of that piece, because that rapport creates trust and a non-judgmental approach, which is really the goal about respite. Mentioning the fact that, a religious component might be present, or ideas or anything grandiose might be present, we really want to be able to allow the people that we serve to express whatever it might be that they're expressing. So we really do it where we meet a person where they are at, with an awareness of safety, of course, because we want to make sure that the person is safe. We're not saying, do we need to call 911? It doesn't come off that way. We really just discover ways of asking in the moment. So that's very, very important to respite. The other piece is, I know we talk so much about compassion, and I'm a big believer about compassion and how we can share and be there for a person that is actually experiencing that moment of suffering. But I think the underlying piece that sometimes gets more missed is empathy, right? So it's really trying to see how we can empathize with another person in the lines of suffering. So what we really do is, as peers, we're able to share our own experience. During the intake process of anyone coming to utilize respite, we ask about religion and spirituality and how important that is. And a lot of the people that, we serve have a component of that. And so we really want to either bring that to the light to show and help a person discover that piece more, or maybe it's to just reintroduce it back again. So it's a big factor through the 8 dimensions of wellness through spirituality that we really touch on, because we know of the importance of that piece to a person. On a personal level, I think empathy is very easy for me to access, because similar to what Christina was mentioning with her story, myself growing up, it was about signs and this happened for this reason, but there was a religious component, because I my background is a Mexican and I was raised Catholic, and so now it's kind of manifested into more of this Jungian thing where these signs and symbols are very important to me. Can you conceptualize it in a mental health piece? Probably not, or as you have discovered, probably so. The point is having that awareness and that discovery allows myself and people that also have a background to really meet the person where they're at, where we're not labeling it as, that idea sounds ludicrous, or how can that be? It's more like, oh, okay, we can kind of reflect and see how in one moment we've also experienced that. So if anything, it's a gift for me to have that piece of awareness of my own spirituality and my religious background. So it allows myself to be so open to whatever anyone brings to the table at respite.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
So thank you, Juliet and Anne. I am a believer of peer respite. I've personally been to a couple of peer respites in my life, and it's damn much better than a hospital, I mean, in a hospital, it's like, in my opinion, it's like going to jail. You take off all your jewelry, you lose all your autonomy, and it's like no one's trying to listen to me. It's just more like medication, right? And sometimes people do need hospitals, so don't get me wrong about that. But when I discovered a respite center, I was like, oh my God, this is peer run. People are validating me. They're listening to me. They're building rapport. They're giving me purpose. And I feel like, wow, I'm empowered by other peers. And when I go home, I feel like, it's like I'm Christina on steroids, I feel so much better. But it's like, even when I went to the hospital one time and I was in a waiting room and So I told the doctor I was in the emergency room. I was like, okay, I don't want to go to the hospital. I want to go to a respite center. He goes, what's a respite center? So most doctors or clinicians, or they don't know what respite centers are. There's not enough information out there for them, including 988. And so we're still stuck on the old traditional models when we need to be going to alternative models like, the respite centers, a clubhouse, or, using other forms of like therapy or, like I mentioned, Reiki, chakra, all types of therapy, but we're just so stuck on a traditional way of, service and care. But thank you for having a respite. I'm happy about that.
Yes. So what really needs to go into the training? Ernie, I know you've done so much training. Your crisis cops did, a lot to improve de-escalation and empathy and compassion of first responders. Now we're at this next level with 988. I would love to hear from each of you and also our viewers, what needs to go into the training? What is the training like? Do we even know? And what needs to go into the training of the whole 988, all the staff, all the people?
So that's a good question, right? Because there's not a national curriculum for call takers when it comes to 988. 988 is left up to the state to run and figure out how they're going to make it, where they're going to put call centers, how they're going to staff it, how they're going to pay for it. So it's really up to the states to figure this out. So as I think as we move forward and continue to try to make this a more robust system, you're going to have to look at some centralized training throughout the states. One thing I think is important, and one thing that we introduced with crisis intervention training, and I've heard this word come up several times today, is trauma. A lot of officers, law enforcement officers, couldn't tell you the true meaning or definition of what trauma is. So they really don't understand it. If I were to ask, if I were to go to a roll call today and just, hey, one of your officers, could you tell me what trauma is? I guarantee you I'm going to probably hear something along the lines of, well, trauma is when something bad happens to you. And that's just truly not the case. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. That's the true definition of trauma. So I think if you understand that, then you will understand why you react the way you do to certain situations, why officers react the way they do about certain situations, why they like handling some calls and they don't, and they try to avoid others. It's no different. This is human behavior than a call taker at 988. They may be dealing with some type of unprocessed trauma that happened to them very early on at an early age. And that's why I think adverse childhood experiences is such an important course to teach, not only to first responders, but to these call takers, because once they truly understand what trauma is, they can add value and benefit to the conversation to the caller that needs assistance, right? But it's an educational process. So I think really at the basic level, you have to start there, because people are calling because either they were triggered, something has not been resolved, and they've just lost their ability to cope. And that's where these call takers are so vitally important, to try to provide that type of resource.
Yes, and bringing up the trauma, the trauma-informed support has been coming out for, I guess, quite a few years now, but it's such an important piece to look at, because again, there is a service and a de-escalation versus let's immediately ship the person to hospitalization and medication. Let's continue the conversation, but I'm asking Dr. Chatlos if you would just respond to this question. Is it possible to differentiate when it's a cultural, spiritual experience and an actual mental disorder? If you could just even briefly comment on that so we respond to that question.
Yeah, I think one of the first things, and maybe the easiest, is to ask the person in any way, is this, or to maybe not ask, but listen, is there anything about what they're describing that connects with their spiritual or religious experience? And then pursue it with some questioning. And again, we have to be aware that that might be part of the problem. And I love, Ernie, your comments about the ACEs and trauma. often, in fact, probably most often in a crisis situation, I do have to also listen for trauma. And was whatever this reaction is just an event in today where something has been triggered? And if I can even begin to make that connection that the person can't, it really makes a big difference for them just to de-escalate themselves. Other things, usually with spiritual experiences versus, let's say, psychosis, persons with spiritual experiences are still very much grounded in reality in many other areas of what is happening with them. So to ask a client, what do they think is going on? What is their understanding? What is their explanation? And I think that's what's great, Juliet, about the peers. Start from your own experience and see if you can connect with them. I think those are probably the most important things, Janet, that I would say right up front can be done that would make a big difference.
Yeah. So there is a big job ahead in general for the 988 training on all the various staff, but now we're also going to we have a very clear intention to add the spiritual component, especially because it's so prevalent. I think one of the figures is at least 49% of Americans have mystical experiences, of which some percentage are going into a spiritual crisis. So it is a common thing that is not often talked about. And we want to service those people in the 988. So I'm going to also then ask to see, what are we looking down the road? Again, we're the first year into this, and there is an urgency to speed up the education, the service, the awareness. Let's hear some alternatives, ideas from both our audience, but from anyone here. And then also marry it with concerns, because there are some of the questions that were raised earlier around without the training, without the awareness, people are picked up, found when they're just calling for help. And there's this numbers, I don't know if we have them here, but numbers of people are moved into hospitals like very quickly. Family, society, responders do not know. So what are your ideals and what are any concerns of what you see happening right now? Would love the team to start sharing. Even if you said it before, it might be worth mentioning again.
Well, Janet, I think, you got to look at the bandwidth of what 988 can handle.
Yeah.
So I was in DC back in January, and we hosted a forecaster along with SAMHSA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the DOJ, and we were talking about, what does a roadmap look like with 988 in conjunction with working and collaborating with law enforcement. And I was moderating one of the panels, and I asked everybody in attendance, who in here is actually called 988? And nobody raised their hand. It's like, but we've been chosen to come together to talk about how we improve this process, but yet nobody knows how it works. Well, I called 988. I wanted to know how it worked. And it was interesting, right? They give you an option if you're a veteran. You have an option if you want the message in Spanish, but you're also going to get a recording at the very beginning. And what I learned by going to a 988 center and watching some of these, and not listening, but watching the calls come in and how they're handled, is if these calls aren't answered in about a 2-minute proximity, then they bounce to the very next tower. And I think Illinois, 80% of their calls to 988 don't even get answered in Illinois. They get bounced because there's such a long wait of callers and a high volume of callers in Illinois, and they just don't have the bandwidth to be able to answer these calls. So you have to look at how do we staff this at such a large scale, and how do we scale it, and then at what point, because we want law enforcement, right? As the calls come into 911, they need to be triaged properly, right? Is this an appropriate call for 911, or can we transfer this call more appropriately to 988 if it is a mental health crisis? But what does that look like? Where's the liability? every time we try to take a step forward with law enforcement, everything has to stop, and city attorneys have to look at it, county attorneys have to look at it. There has to be a consensus that this is a safe way to do things. Now, in Englewood, Colorado, their police department there has begun to transfer calls to 988 on a very small scale. What they're trying to do is scale up to be able to get Denver, which is their largest city there, to be able to transfer these calls. The problem is the bandwidth. They just don't have the amount of call takers to be able to handle the sheer volume of the calls coming in. So I think you really have to look logistically of how do we build a framework of a good working basis of a workforce to where we can even handle these calls. And then once we know we can handle the sheer volume of it, now we have to figure out how do we get law enforcement to now come closer to the table, because they're not even in the same room right now because of the liability issues, to get them to understand that, hey, the majority of these calls that go to 988, 98% of them are handled over the phone. It's so difficult to recruit in law enforcement. Call any law enforcement agency and ask them how many officers they're down. You know, they're going to say for your larger agencies, 500. Austin PD, 3, 4, 500. San Antonio, 3, 4, 500. New York, thousands. So why not collaborate with 988 as a way to say, hey, we're going to help take some of this load off of you by allowing mental health calls to go to mental health professionals. The problem with law enforcement is, and I'll say this because I was there for so long, we complain. We don't want to take all these mental health calls. You know, we're not social workers, but the minute you try to take them away and say, hey, well, we're going to start transferring these calls or send them to a community responder team where it's a medic and a clinician to respond, we're going to take law enforcement right out of it. Well, what are you doing? You're going to get civilians killed. You can't do that, right? So there's this push-pull, and it's a constant battle of what's the best way to handle these calls. Right now, if they come in at 911, the liability is it's going to stay with 911 until you can get some progressive leadership to say, hey, there's a better resource for this particular call based on the triage, and we can send this to 988.
Could we have some comments, Anne? What are you looking to try to influence? Christina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I have an answer for Ernie's a statement. So basically, in Brooklyn, New York, as part of the Assembly members Monique Chandler's Waterman's task force, we have a monthly meeting for the community, and we educate the community members on 988. We have a linked NYC system where it's like a portal of like charging system as a replacement of a telephone in the street, where you can actually press the button 988 and speak to an operator on 988, because we can't assume that everybody has a phone, right? So also at our meetings, we invite NYPD there as well, the local precincts, and we give them 988 cards, right? So when they're in the community, when they're engaging with people in the community, they can also give out the 988 cards. And when they're responding to some of the crisis calls, they can give out the 988 calls. So people will know, don't call 911. You can call 988 for mental health services. So that's what we're doing in Brooklyn.
Anne, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I noticed that you posted that Mad in America article, which talks about the 120% increase in psychiatric detention since the first year of 988. And I think that goes back to what I said earlier, in terms of just transparency, letting folks know that when they call 988, there is a possibility that it can lead to a non-consensual intervention, i.e. police or emergency response, so that they can make an informed decision of whether or not to utilize the service. I think there should also be more parity with other alternatives, like we've been talking about respite, but also warm lines, where folks can kind of explore these feelings without the fear of police intervention or other emergency intervention and the potential of re-traumatization and hospitalization. So, just from our experience here in New Jersey, it's been a year of 988. We've to date only received one referral to our respite houses from 988. And to me, I think that's a shame, right? I think there are alternatives that folks, if they knew were an opportunity, they would take it, right? Our respites, we're fortunate in New Jersey, there's no cost for our respite services. adults 18 and up can utilize it. As a person with lived experience, I had my first crisis when I was in college. I was dealing with suicidal ideation. I ultimately had to drop out of Rutgers and had to quit my job. And, I was attending Rutgers, New Brunswick. I'm happy today that there is a respite literally a mile from where I attended school and ultimately didn't have that opportunity. I'm glad that there is that opportunity for folks to take advantage of alternatives, because hospitalization was not going to be an option for me. It was, I had family members who had, been traumatized in hospitals, and I heard the stories, from the different generations in my family, and that was not going to be an option for me. So I think there's a lot of folks out there who might have had, unfortunately, similar circumstances, or, they heard about the trauma from hospitalization or experienced it firsthand, and are very concerned about who they would share any potential emotional distress with. Right. And I think, what sets our respites apart is that wellness focus, right? We're a peer wellness respite. And, we're fortunate that at CSP&J, we have Dr. Peggy Swarbrick at our Wellness Institute, and she's, the person who developed the 8 Dimensions of Wellness model. And that's how, what we use to work with folks. I mean, we take a look at those 8 dimensions of wellness: social wellness, spiritual wellness, emotional wellness, of course, physical wellness. And we take a look at how all of those are interacting and coming together. I know in my experience, anytime I was in crisis, my physical wellness had been imbalanced, right? I wasn't sleeping well, I wasn't eating well. And so I think letting folks know about other alternatives and models, and reminding folks about their strengths, right? In terms of social wellness, it's not uncommon for guests to have come to us who might have been isolating, right, and experiencing loneliness. We know, the Surgeon General, made that report that, loneliness is an epidemic right now as well, and we're seeing that. But I think, just to tie back to our conversation, folks need to know, they need to have the full picture so they can determine whether or not to use 988. And we need to really see that parity with other alternatives, such as warm lines, respites, and, community wellness centers, clubhouse models, that sort of thing.
I love that language: warm lines, clubhouse models, respites. I want to make some linkages here. We are definitely hosting a 988 event, probably different than most. Anything that's going out on 988 does not, I'm imagining, talking about the spiritual part. But let me raise the value of, Anne, you sharing, you're a COO of a major organization, and you're here sharing that you also had a personal experience, personal crisis. And what I learned from you and Dr. Chatlos, you have also shared that as well. And neither one of you had 911 called on you, didn't have a wellness, you didn't have a cop come into your house. Somehow you avoided it. You laid low, you found other ways. In my instances, I did have police called in a wellness check. And even though I was very calm, centered, clear thinking, I had just come back from a presentation on Wall Street, showing all my notes, like, wait a minute, this is, it's not what you think. But because they were called for a wellness check by a family member, they basically said, I have to go in. So that's also what we want to prevent, that people, have that chance to have agency, and that there's awareness, even just to have a conversation versus an immediate exit and escort. Dr. Chatlos, do you want to comment,
Jen,
or anyone else?
I would like to comment, and especially follow up with what Anne said. One of the problems with the system, the psychiatric system, the mental health system, is we are focused on pathology. We're focused on what's wrong, what's broken, let's fix it, rather than what is the well-being. One of the things that we're finding in working with spirituality, that there are certain experiences of self-worth and dignity that when we empower them, rather than trying to diagnose, something opens up. The agency opens up, the creative problem solving opens up. And I think part of the training that I don't hear anyone talking about in spiritual competency is how do we listen to empower the client's self-worth and dignity in the middle of a crisis. And there's a way to do that. And if we can do that with the first responders, and then my vision is that psychiatry begins to move from a pathology model to a wellness model of some sort. And I think I'm biased. I think that spirituality is the bridge. How to make that happen on a national level, we have yet to see, but I do think we need to have the conversation, because I do think it really has some keys when we understand it well. So,
Ernie,
Thanks for sharing that. That's amazing.
yes.
Thank you.
Again, anybody can call, but Ernie, you've had such lengthy experience in the de-escalation of mental health calls. Is there something we can borrow, learn from the amount of training you did over the years? And that, I don't know, can we transfer that also into the whole 988 training?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for you giving me way too much credit. But I think, and I love what Dr. Shotlis just said. He used the word well-being. I think law enforcement has to redefine what safety is, right? Safety is no longer can be seen as the absence of crime. It has to be seen as the presence of well-being. And that means the in total well-being of a community. The part of the lessons I learned about responding to an individual in crisis is you have to look at the person and not the problem, right? The problem is usually emotionally charged in some way, form, or fashion. But if you can look at the person and truly connect with them, then you will get a connection over correction. That means let's not look at correcting the issue, the problem, whatever you want to label it. Let's make a connection with this person. And we can do so by looking at the person and not the problem. And I think by doing that, that's how you create empathy. And there's power in that. There's power in human connection. And in the documentary, I use the example of a lamp. When you unplug a lamp, it doesn't work. Same thing with a person. When a person becomes unplugged, they don't work as well, right? They begin to digress, and it becomes dangerous to be in that, and to be, in that environment, when you've lost all hope or you're feeling worthless. And so I think by really focusing on the person in that moment through empathy and human connection, it doesn't matter if you're a call taker, a first responder, or a family member. You truly have to learn how to listen to a person. And listening doesn't mean trying to problem solve by giving them the answer to what you think solves their problem. Because I promise you, you're not in their shoes and it's not your problem. The best thing you can do is just simply listen and validate and be there as a resource for that person and show your support and love. So I think whether you're showing up in person or you're a call taker, these are lessons that should be foundational.
Yes. And, imagine the amount of human suffering that can be saved by doing that. And I'm going to put some not numbers, but financial pieces, how much money can be saved by listening and talking. And even Ernie, I keep picturing you de-escalating the family who was called in 988 on the person, and that you could actually sit down and talk with the family to de-escalate. This is not a hospital situation. And the human suffering that gets saved, and the financial burden that gets saved by not just reacting. We are almost 10 minutes we have left. I'm going to be inviting Mark McCormack in from the back room. He's been assisting us with the technical aspects, but Mark is part of our global team. He is from Canada. He is lived experience, having gone through some scenarios of which we may or may not touch on it, because Ernie had an experience with someone that similar to what you went through. But Mark is lived experience, but also is leading some major initiatives around the globe, but also working with litigation around forced hospitalization and forced meds. So we're going to ask everyone to think about what would you like to say as a closure, but we want to welcome Mark in from the back room to comment, because you've been watching all of this and I know you're very passionate about the whole 988 and how it needs to work. Mark.
Yeah, I feel very blessed to be amongst you guys and hearing what you have to say, because we're sort of on an uphill battle. And, you know, it's a little bit of a risk to go out and say, hey, this is what happened to me. And we're doing it very publicly to sort of galvanize a lot of confidence in people who might be sitting back and thinking, well, you know, what's going on in the world is kind of normal. You know, I need to sort of step back and sort of take maybe responsibility for myself. But I think that the bigger perspective here, and also how I ended up getting into the system myself, is that we're all realizing that there's a crisis building, and it's going to be mental health. Mental health is now going to be the number one crisis our species faces. It's like the final frontier, because as Anne was saying, you know, the Surgeon General themselves said that we're in an epidemic of loneliness. 1 in 2 people, including the Surgeon General in that article, admitted they themselves were lonely. Yet we have hyper connection. Like there's this external connection and not this like spiritual interconnection that we need to have this competence over. And I think 988 is going to explode. I think lots of people are going to start pouring in, because I ended up going into a peaceful protest to prepare sort of our societies for this sort of reality collapse that's supposed to be coming with AI, climate change, these extreme events that, you know, we're all trying to deal with in the back of our minds. Like, is this normal? And it's pushing people to the edge. What is reality? And they're actually saying in scientific and engineering communities that we're going to experience something called reality collapse, which mimics sort of like psychosis. And I think right now, we were speaking to some Hollywood executives, and they were saying right now, for some reason, spiritual movies are in vogue. Like people are looking for meaning. They're looking for something like, you know, we're more likely to die from suicide and a lack of meaning than ever before in human history, even more than some external causes. And so these existential mental health crises are going to start increasing as the AI revolution gets more intense here in the next year or 2 or 3. So, I mean, if we're already struggling to supply the lines with the proper training, whether it's spiritual or not, we're about to experience an explosion, I think. And I really, really support what you guys are saying. If there's any way we can get more resources to you, we're going to try and use litigation. Like I'm going to use my court case to try and build as much awareness and in a campaign as possible, and then make a template to give people the confidence that if this happened to them, like we have 47 violations, if any of these happen to you, come forward, and we're going to try and generate maybe a class action lawsuit at the national level, but also the international level. And there's some interest in that with law firms. Rob Whitaker was also speaking to us about it a little bit. He said, this is the time to start doing this. And I really think that if we don't do it now, it might come a little bit too late, too little. And Ernie, I really think that if there's some way that we can get the line more robust and mixed in with a spiritual competency, because a lot of these crises are in an area where we don't really understand who we are, what we're doing here. These spiritual questions are going to become the forefront, because meaning is slowly sort of changing as AI seems to replace all of our jobs at a crazy pace. Like we didn't think this was going to happen until 10 years from now, and it's happening right now. So I really feel like I hope these comments sort of support everything that was said here today. I really think that this is something new, Jana, that you're putting together that hasn't been done before. And what might have been impossible for previous mental health movements might be possible for us because of the amazing people that are in the room right now and the amazing energy and sort of spiritual gravity that you're bringing in. That's also scientific and something that maybe a contemporary society can grapple with, and maybe a dialogic approach, an open dialogue approach. And I'm very much on board 100% right to the end. So you guys can count on me.
Mark from Canada, thank you for weighing in.
Janet,
yes.
Could I say something that hasn't been mentioned that Mark, you made me think of, especially as several people here, we've had lived experience. One of the failures of the mental health system up to this point is that, yes, there may be psychiatric disorders, there may be psychiatric diagnoses, and with treatment, that does not mean we lead an abnormal life.
Yes.
Today, people can have bipolar disorder, major depression, and absolutely lead a normal life to the point where, you know, if people met us individually and we had lived experience, they'd never know it.
Right. Right. That brings us into a wider conversation that we will do more lives on, that, you know, the benefits of diagnosis and how some people are very thankful and get that treatment, and the harms of saying, you know, you're this label and you have to take meds for the rest of your life. That's horrifying. But that is also not the topic of today. What I want to do, but thank you, all that connects. I do want to give each guest a chance to make a closing comment. We will use this recording in education. It will be available on our Facebook and our YouTube probably by next week. Mark, we're so glad that you helped us with the back room and also came on here and are also part of our global team. So I will then just invite each person to do a short closing. We still do invite any comments or questions. If we don't get to them within our time period, we'll address them on our Facebook page. So who would like to do your closing comment, your message to the world of 988? Let's figure this out fast. Who'd like to go?
Janet, I'll throw in some comments, and really they're just resources. Exactly what Christina said. You know, the more we know about it, the more we know how to be informative to other people, I think is going to help really get the message out about what 988 is, when to call it. Again, like I said, I work at the Council of State Governments Justice Center right now. We have online resources that are free. We have a 988 pocket card for law enforcement, kind of like what Christina held up, but it's for law enforcement officers to go to them so they can read it, understand it, and then hand it out to the public. And then we also have some videos online with interviews with chiefs of police, sheriffs, dispatchers, and call takers. It's called 988, A Shared Opportunity. You can Google those and watch those videos and kind of get a better understanding. Be sure to share them. One of the most important things you can do is have a conversation with your local law enforcement agency of what 988 is. Try to get that into some CIT training curriculum within your local law enforcement agency, and really at the jails. And because when you talk about reentry programs for people getting out of jail, they may not know what resources are available to them, especially if they've been locked up for the past year and not heard of 988. So this is a good opportunity to educate and give resources to people that are re-entering into the community from the jail population.
Excellent. Thank you, Ernie. We will have you back. We'll invite you back. Who would like to go next as a closing comment, your message that will, you know, be shared as we go forward?
I would like to,
Yes.
There's something that I'm going to take away that I hope everyone listening to this takes away. And Ernie, that came from you. Look at the person, not the problem. When we look at the person, empathy starts to connect. The compassion begins to connect. The spiritual open-heartedness is really what it's about. If we can train responders to listen to that part before we get afraid and jump to a knee-jerk reaction. So, Ernie, thank you. I think that's a message that should be in any simple training.
In our AWARE program. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Closing comments. Who else would like to go? Anne and Juliet?
I'll go. So I think one more thing I just want to be specific about is, you know, the reason that I didn't seek help when I was in crisis in undergrad was because I feared hospitalization, like forced hospitalization or forced treatment. So I think the importance of transparency and alternatives to hospitalization and the importance can't be understated. So I really appreciate the time to be here and just talking about this. It's a really important dialogue. So thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Yes. And we'll put some of these other resources. The fact that Calvin and I just discovered that it exists. Calvin gets to refer some of his clients to you, and that we have a national directory. And we want to publicize that, you know, and it's not just to the call takers, it's to families and friends to know. So Juliet, do you want to have a closing comment? Can Juliet, are you mute? Juliet? Oh, it's unmute. There we go.
Yes,
Juliet?
I can hear you. I'm lagging a little bit. Okay, great. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for welcoming CPNJ and Ann and I. The message is really that recovery is possible, that there is hope there, and that really respite is really to instill that hope back to our hearts through a peer approach. And really awareness of our peer work and collaboration with 988, to use us as an alternative to using the hospital. As a peer, I avoided, more of a domestic violence, more background piece. And if respite would have been known to myself, I would have definitely utilized it. So hopefully 988, we can collaborate and make sure that we bring this awareness to everyone nationwide, hopefully. So thank you, everyone.
Great. And Ann and Juliet, maybe Dr. Chatlos, when you go to the New Jersey 988 event tomorrow, you have lots to talk about and share. So let's see how we can influence one state at a time. Christina, would you have some closing comment?
Yeah, so something that I said earlier. So I said in order to support the amount of 988 calls coming in, our country should invest in adequate, culturally responsive, person-centered, trauma-informed, affordable, and gender-appropriate services. In addition to that, we need to have more peers at the seat of the table when having conversations on the improvement of 988. This will reduce peers from cycling in and out of the system and minimize the instances of emotional wellness for our community.
I gotta say it. Amen. Sorry, I gotta say it. Why am I saying sorry? Thank you so much. We do like to wrap up on time. Maybe we gave our audience lots to think about, and please join us on our Facebook Media That Matters with questions. This will be posted. We will cause more of a conversation as we go forward. Just to keep in mind, part of what our global team is doing to support the entire initiative is to bring a documentary out into public around all of these issues we raise, not just 988, and to also do a feature-length movie. We are looking for collaborators in all parts of the organizations, investors, and supporters to help build these global initiatives. Oh, there we go. That is a link to the IMDb for our documentary. So I want to thank you. We will be scheduling a follow-up in August. Again, 988. We will have some of you back if you wish, and we will be adding other leaders from New Jersey and around the nation. So thank you.
Janet, thank you for hosting this and giving us the opportunity for this. Great job.
Excellent.
Thank you.
You're amazing, Janet. Thank
Bye.
you.
If our guests stay on, I'm going to end the broadcast and see if you all stay on. I think that might work. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.